Jackson County, Mississippi, 2003. A beloved 19-year-old college student, the trusted face of her community pool, vanished at the end of her shift. Her father found her moments too late, the victim of an attack by a phantom-like transient who disappeared without a trace. When the official investigation stalled, her father, a quiet maintenance supervisor, refused to let her become another cold case. He would launch a public crusade, plastering the suspect's face on billboards across the South, sparking a multi-state manhunt to take down the man who shattered his world. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you the story. The summer of 2003 fell across Jackson County, Mississippi, like a thick, warm blanket. It was a season defined by the drone of cicadas in the dense pine forests, the sweet, earthy smell of impending afternoon rain, and the slow, steady rhythm of life in a community where roots ran deep. In the tight-knit, predominantly black neighborhood where the Kemp family lived, the world felt knowable, its boundaries drawn by familiar faces and shared histories. This was a place of front porch conversations that bled into dusk, of screen doors slamming shut as children were called in for dinner, and of an unspoken pact that everyone looked out for one another's kids. It was a place that felt, above all else, safe. At the center of this world, or at least at the center of the Kemp's world, was their 19-year-old daughter, Alicia. Known to everyone as Ali, she was home from her first year of college, a milestone that had filled her parents with a profound, quiet pride. Ali was the living embodiment of their hard work and their hopes for the future. She possessed a calm, gentle spirit that seemed to radiate from her, a natural grace that put people at ease. Her smile was genuine, her sense of responsibility unwavering. She was, in the words of the parents who entrusted their children to her care each day, a good kid, a great kid. Her summer job was as the front desk manager and de facto guardian of the community pool, a role she'd held for 3 years. The pool was the vibrant, beating heart of the neighborhood's summer life, a shimmering turquoise oasis carved out of the Mississippi heat. It was a place of joyous shrieks and cannonballs, of teenagers gossiping on lounge chairs, and of toddlers taking their first hesitant dips in the shallow end. And overseeing it all was Ali, a steady, reassuring presence behind the sign-in desk. She knew every child's name, every parent's face. She was the one who handed out popsicles, who gently enforced the no-running rule, and who always had a kind word for everyone. She wasn't just an employee, she was a fixture, a part of the fabric of their collective summer. Her father, Ronald Kemp, saw that same steadfastness in her that he tried to embody in his own life. As the maintenance supervisor for the entire county school district, Ronald's world was one of order, logic, and methodical problem-solving. He was a man of quiet competence, his hands as skilled at diagnosing a faulty boiler as they were at tending the prize-winning roses in his front yard. He moved through the world with a patient, deliberate energy, his mind always working, always analyzing. He understood systems, whether they were the complex electrical grids of a high school or the unspoken social networks of his community. He was respected, not for being loud, but for being right. When Ronald Kemp said something would be done, it was as good as done. He found a deep satisfaction in making things work, in restoring order to chaos, a principle he had instilled in his daughter. Her mother, Janice, was the heart of the family, a beloved third-grade teacher whose classroom was a haven of warmth and encouragement. Where Ronald was the quiet anchor, Janice was the gentle breeze. She understood people, especially children, with an intuitive grace that was a gift. She saw the world in terms of connections, of the invisible threads that bound their community together. She saw Ali not just as her daughter, but as a bright, shining thread in that beautiful tapestry. The family was a perfect trinity of purpose, heart, and hope. Their small, immaculately kept home on a quiet, tree-lined street was a sanctuary, a testament to a life built on hard work, faith, and a deep, abiding love for each other and the community they served. On this particular Saturday in late July, the golden hour of the afternoon was settling in, and everything felt exactly as it should be. The world was in its proper place, the rhythm of their lives steady and unbroken. The first discordant note in the symphony of that perfect Saturday arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't a crash or a scream, but an absence. It was the 6 o'clock hour coming and going without the familiar sound of Ali's sedan pulling into the driveway. Janice Kemp was in the kitchen, the comforting aroma of baked chicken and roasting potatoes filling the small house. She glanced at the clock on the stove, a small frown line appearing between her eyebrows. Ali's shift ended at 5:30. She was always home by 6, her punctuality as reliable as the setting Sunday. Janice wiped her hands on her apron, telling herself not to worry. Perhaps a parent had stopped to chat after closing, or she was helping the younger lifeguards with the final cleanup. Ali was responsible. There was always a reason. At 6:15, Janice picked up the phone and dialed her daughter's cell. It went straight to voicemail, the cheerful recorded greeting a stark contrast to the knot of unease tightening in her stomach. That was unusual. Ali's phone was her lifeline. She never let the battery die. "Just checking in, sweetie," Janice said, keeping her voice light. "Dinner's almost ready. Call me when you get this." She began setting the table, her movements a little too precise, a little too deliberate. The silence in the house, usually a peaceful backdrop, now felt heavy, charged with unspoken questions. Ronald came in from the backyard, his hands clean after an hour spent tending to his rose bushes. He saw the look on his wife's face and knew immediately. "Ali not home yet?" he asked, his voice calm. Her phone went to voicemail. Janice replied, the worry now evident in her tone. "I'm sure it's nothing, but—" Ronald nodded, his mind already shifting from the simple logic of gardening to the more complex calculus of a parent's concern. He took out his own phone and dialed. Voicemail. He then called the main line at the pool. It rang and rang, unanswered. The knot in Janice's stomach was now a cold, heavy stone in his. By 7 o'clock, with the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of their neighborhood, the pretense of normalcy had evaporated. Janice had called a half-dozen of Ali's friends. None had seen her. The story was the same from each. Ali had mentioned heading straight home after her shift. The carefully constructed peace of their evening had shattered, replaced by a frantic, terrifying uncertainty. Ronald made the decision with a quiet finality. "I'm going down there." He didn't wait for a reply, just grabbed his keys from the bowl by the door. The drive to the pool, usually a pleasant 5-minute trip through familiar streets, felt agonizingly long. Every detail seemed to mock the growing dread inside him. He saw families on their porches, their silhouettes framed by the warm glow of their living room lights. He heard the distant laughter of children playing in the fading light. It was a world carrying on as normal, oblivious to the fact that his own world was tilting off its axis. He pulled into the pool's parking lot, and his heart seized. Ali's car, a modest blue sedan they had bought her for her 18th birthday, was sitting right there, parked neatly in its usual spot. It was the only car left. For a moment, a wave of relief washed over him. Maybe she'd gotten a ride with a friend and forgotten to call. But the relief was instantly extinguished by a cold, hard fact. Ali would never have left her car unlocked, let alone with her purse sitting in plain view on the passenger seat. He got out of his truck, the gravel crunching under his boots with an unnaturally loud sound. The air was still and humid, thick with the scent of chlorine and freshly cut grass. He called her name, his voice sounding small and foreign in the vast empty space. "Ali." Only the chirping of crickets answered. The silence that came back at him was not a peaceful silence. It was a dead, empty void. It was the silence of something terribly wrong. He walked towards the main gate. It was unlocked, swinging slightly ajar in the gentle evening breeze. Beyond it, he could see the pool, its surface a placid dark mirror reflecting the twilight sky. The locker room lights were still on, casting a pale, sterile glow across the empty concrete deck. Everything was still. Too still. A place that had been teeming with life and laughter just a few hours ago was now a ghost scene, and his daughter was somewhere within it. Ronald Kemp's mind, trained by decades of methodical work, fought against the rising tide of panic. He forced himself to breathe, to think, to be the man who solved problems. Fear was a useless tool. He needed a process. He began a systematic sweep of the property, his steps measured and deliberate, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. He started with the main building, pushing open the door to the women's locker room. The air was cool and damp, the buzzing of a fluorescent light overhead the only sound. Towels were folded neatly on a bench. The faint scent of Ali's preferred coconut shampoo lingered near her locker, which stood open and empty. Nothing. He checked the men's locker room, the small concessions stand, the front office where Ali spent most of her day. Everything was in order, closed down for the night with a familiar, practiced neatness that was so characteristic of his daughter. The cash drawer was locked, the daily sign-in sheets were stacked, a half-finished crossword puzzle lay on her desk. It was as if she had simply vanished in the middle of a perfectly ordinary task. He walked the perimeter of the chain-link fence, his gaze sweeping across the manicured lawn, the empty picnic tables, the silent, imposing lifeguard chairs standing like lonely sentinels in the growing darkness. The scene was pristine, undisturbed. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of anything amiss. Yet, the wrongness of it all was a physical weight on his shoulders. His circuit brought him to the back of the property, to the area behind the diving boards where the mechanical systems were housed. Here stood a large, windowless utility shed, a simple cinder block structure where the pool chemicals, cleaning supplies, and maintenance equipment were stored. It was a place Ronald knew well. He had helped the county install the new filtration pump just last spring. As he approached, his flashlight beam caught something that broke the pattern of orderly closure. The heavy-duty steel latch on the shed door was bent at an unnatural angle, the metal warped as if it had been forced. The thick padlock that should have secured it was missing. His heart began to pound a heavy, frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was it. This was the break in the pattern. This was the chaos in the order. He pushed the heavy door. It scraped open with a low groan. The air that rolled out was thick, stagnant, and heavy with the acrid smell of chlorine. He swept his flashlight beam across the interior. Shelves stacked with plastic jugs of chemicals, coiled hoses, a lawnmower, bags of salt. Everything looked normal, crowded but orderly. And then the beam fell upon a small, cleared space in the far corner, behind a large rolling trash bin. For a fraction of a second, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. It was a shape, a form, lying unnaturally still on the cold concrete floor. It was his daughter. The panic he had so carefully suppressed broke free, a roaring, blinding wave of pure terror. But his body acted before his mind could shatter. Years of training, of dealing with emergencies, took over. He was at her side in an instant, his fingers going to her neck, searching for a pulse, for any sign of life. He found none. He saw that she was unresponsive, that she was gone. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of sound and light, the beam of his flashlight dancing wildly across the walls. A raw, guttural sound escaped his own throat, a sound of such profound, animalistic grief that it seemed to be torn from the very depths of his soul. But even in that moment of absolute devastation, the man of systems, the man of process, did not completely break. His shaking hand found his phone. He dialed 911. The words came out, clipped, precise, an island of coherence in an ocean of pain. My daughter, Alicia Kemp. She's at the community pool on Elm Street, in the back utility shed. She's been harmed. She's not breathing. Please, send someone now. He didn't remember the paramedics arriving or the police. He only remembered the cold, hard reality of the concrete floor beneath his knees and the devastating, irreversible silence where his daughter's heartbeat should have been. The family was shattered. The community was shaken to its core. The safe, predictable world of their Mississippi summer had been ripped apart, and in its place was a gaping, horrifying void. Ronald Kemp's grief was a bottomless, silent ocean. But beneath the surface of that grief, something else was beginning to form. A cold, hard, and burning purpose. The arrival of the Jackson County Sheriff's Department transformed the tranquil community pool into a stark, clinical crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off the entire property, its bright, artificial color a jarring intrusion against the natural greens and blues of the summer landscape. The flashing lights of patrol cars pulsed through the night, painting the familiar neighborhood in unsettling strokes of red and blue. The investigation began with the slow, methodical pace of professionals trained to read the story left behind by violence. Detectives moved through the scene with a quiet, practiced efficiency. They photographed everything, from the blue sedan in the parking lot to the half-finished crossword puzzle on Ali's desk. They dusted for fingerprints, collected fibers, and swabbed for DNA. The utility shed became the focal point of their work, a small, grim stage where the final act of a tragedy had unfolded. They analyzed the bent latch, the scuff marks on the floor, the overturned chair just inside the doorway. Every detail was a potential clue, a piece of a puzzle they were just beginning to assemble. The first significant piece emerged from the front office. Tucked under a clipboard on Ali's desk was a stack of applications for a part-time maintenance assistant, a position the pool had been looking to fill. One form, dated just that day, stood out. The handwriting was a rushed, almost illegible scrawl. The name listed was John Smith, a clear red flag. The address was a vacant lot on the other side of the county. The phone number was disconnected. It was the application of a ghost, a man who clearly had something to hide. Detectives bagged it as primary evidence, hoping the paper held a fingerprint, a trace of the man who had filled it out. The next piece came from the community itself. As news of the tragedy spread, a wave of shock and grief washed over the neighborhood, but it also jogged memories. A woman who lived in a house backing onto the pool property came forward. She tearfully recalled seeing Ali in a heated conversation with a man near the back fence late that afternoon. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Ali often had to deal with rule breakers or disgruntled patrons. But now, the memory was chilling. She described the man as a wiry, rough-looking white man in his late 30s, wearing greasy work clothes and driving an older model white pickup truck. This lead sent detectives scrambling for surveillance footage. The pool itself had no cameras, a fact that now seemed like a catastrophic oversight. However, a small convenience store at the end of the street had a single camera pointed at the intersection. After hours of reviewing the grainy, time-lapsed footage, they found it, at 5:42 p.m., just 12 minutes after Ali's shift had officially ended. A beat-up white Ford pickup truck with a distinctive rust pattern on the driver's side door was recorded turning away from the pool's direction and heading toward the highway. The image was too blurry to make out a license plate, but it was a solid, tangible lead. The forensic lab delivered the final, crucial pieces of the initial investigation. The ghost application held a clear, identifiable set of fingerprints. More prints, matching the ones on the form, were lifted from the armrest of the overturned chair in the shed and from the exterior of the shed door. DNA evidence, not belonging to Ali, was also recovered from the scene. They now had a physical profile of their suspect, his fingerprints, his DNA, a description of his vehicle, and a likely modus operandi. He was a transient, a man who used aliases to secure low-level jobs at public facilities, places where he could blend in and find opportunities. The suspect's name, they soon learned from a hit in a regional database, was Earl Danner. He had a scattered record of minor offenses in 3 different states, each time under a different name. He was a predator who thrived on anonymity, moving from town to town, from job to job, leaving little trace of his existence. The detectives now had a clear picture of their quarry. He was a ghost, but he was a ghost who had left his shadow behind. The challenge, they knew, would not be identifying him, but finding him. In the vast, open expanses of the American South, a man who wanted to disappear could do so with frightening ease. The paper trail had given them a name and a face, but he was already gone, vanished into the wind. In the days that followed Ali's death, the Kemp house became a sanctuary of sorrow. A steady stream of neighbors, friends, and church members flowed through the front door, bringing with them covered dishes, heartfelt condolences, and the shared heavy weight of a community in mourning. Janice, buoyed by the support of her friends and her unwavering faith, moved through the rituals of grief with a fragile, heartbreaking grace. She found solace in the stories people shared about Ali, in the confirmation that her daughter's brief life had touched so many others. She sought comfort in connection, in the embrace of her community. Ronald, however, retreated inward. He was present. He was gracious. He thanked every person who came to offer their sympathies, but a part of him had walled itself off. He moved through his home like a ghost, the silence where Ali's laughter should have been a constant deafening roar in his ears. His grief was a vast, desolate landscape, and he was walking through it alone. He would stand in the doorway of her empty bedroom, the space kept exactly as she had left it, a perfect, painful time capsule of a life interrupted. He saw her textbooks on the desk, a sweater tossed over a chair, a future stolen in a single, brutal act of violence. The sorrow was a physical force, threatening to crush him, but beneath the crushing weight of that sorrow, the seed of purpose that had been planted on that terrible night in the shed began to germinate. It was nurtured by a quiet, burning anger. An anger not at God, not at the world, but at the man who had done this, and at the possibility that he might simply get away with it. Ronald's methodical mind, the mind that understood systems and processes, began to analyze the situation with a cold, detached clarity. He attended every meeting with the lead detectives from the sheriff's department. He listened intently, his expression unreadable, as they laid out the evidence they had gathered. The fingerprints, the DNA, the fake application, the description of the white pickup truck. He saw the competence in their eyes, the genuine desire to solve the case. But he also saw the reality of their situation. The lead detective, a good man named Harris, was juggling a dozen other serious cases. The department's resources were stretched thin. Their jurisdiction ended at the county line. Earl Danner had vanished, and the trail was growing colder with every passing day. The search was now a passive one, his name entered into national databases, his description sent out to law enforcement agencies across the region. They were waiting for a hit, for Danner to make a mistake, to get pulled over for a broken taillight in some other state. Ronald could not accept that. He could not stand the thought of his daughter's justice being left to chance, to the whims of bureaucratic inertia or the luck of a random traffic stop. Waiting was not in his nature. He was a man of action, a man who fixed what was broken. The system designed to deliver justice was, in his view, broken. It was too slow, too overburdened, too impersonal to match the urgency of his grief. His purpose began to solidify, to take shape in the long, sleepless nights. The initial, raw desire for accountability hardened into a clear, methodical plan. If the official channels were too slow, he would have to create his own. If their reach was too short, he would have to extend it. He would not interfere with their investigation. He would not play detective. But he would not sit by and wait for a file to gather dust on a shelf. One evening, about a month after the funeral, he sat down with Janice at the kitchen table. The casseroles had stopped coming, the stream of visitors had slowed to a trickle, and the house was quiet again, but it was a new, hollow kind of quiet. "They're going to forget about her," Ronald said, his voice low and steady, devoid of emotion but filled with an unshakable conviction. "Not the people here, but the system. Her case will get buried under new ones. The man who did this will be 1,000 miles away, living under a new name, and we'll just be waiting." Janice looked at her husband, at the new, hard lines around his eyes, and saw the depth of his resolve. "What are you going to do, Ronald?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm going to make sure they can't forget," he said. "I'm going to make sure that no matter where he runs, her face is there waiting for him." In that moment, the grieving father receded, and the maintenance supervisor, the problem solver, the man who would restore order to his shattered world, took his place. His private ocean of sorrow had found its channel, and it was about to become a relentless, unstoppable river. The transition from summer to fall in Jackson County was a slow, subtle one. The oppressive heat gradually relented. The evenings grew cooler, and the vibrant green of the landscape began to soften into the muted tones of autumn. For most of the community, the changing seasons brought a return to familiar routines, the start of a new school year, the approach of the holidays. The raw, gaping wound of Ali's death began to scar over, becoming a part of the town's collective memory, a tragedy spoken of with a sad, quiet reverence. The community pool, closed for the season, stood as a silent, mournful monument. For Ronald Kemp, however, time had stopped. He existed in an endless, agonizing loop of the day he lost his daughter. The changing leaves and the cooling air meant only one thing. More time was passing, and Earl Danner was still free. His monthly check-ins with Detective Harris at the Sheriff's Department became a painful, predictable ritual. The detective was always professional, always empathetic, but the updates were always the same. "We've got his prints and his DNA in CODIS, Ronald," Harris would explain, his voice tinged with a weary frustration. "Every agency in the country has his file. If he gets picked up for so much as spitting on the sidewalk, we'll get an alert. We're doing everything we can with the resources we have." Ronald understood the constraints. He knew Harris was a good man in a difficult position, but understanding did not quell the rising tide of his impatience. The system was a vast, passive net, and he was being asked to simply trust that a monster would one day stumble into it. To Ronald, this was an abdication of responsibility. Justice, he believed, should be an active pursuit, not a passive hope. He saw his daughter's case file slipping down the priority list, buried under the weight of new, more immediate crimes, with fresh leads and local suspects. Ali was becoming a cold case, a ghost in a filing cabinet, and he could feel it happening with every passing day. His resolve, once a quiet, internal fire, was now a carefully managed, all-consuming project. He began to spend his evenings in his workshop, a space once reserved for woodworking and home repairs. Now, it was his command center. He spread out county and state maps on his workbench, charting the most likely escape routes from Jackson County. He read everything he could find about apprehending fugitives, about how transient criminals moved and operated. He was learning, studying, preparing. The most crucial step he took was reaching out to a man named Frank Garrison, a retired detective from the Jackson Police Department who was a distant friend from his church. Frank was a man in his late 60s, sharp-witted and clear-eyed, with 30 years of experience in homicide. He listened to Ronald's story, to his fears about the case going cold, and he saw a man not bent on vengeance, but on a methodical, relentless quest for accountability. He agreed to help, to mentor Ronald on how to conduct a public campaign without compromising the official investigation. "You can't be a vigilante, Ronald," Frank warned him during their first meeting, his voice firm but kind. "You can't go chasing down leads yourself. You'll get hurt, or you'll taint the evidence. But what you can be is a force multiplier. You can be the eyes and ears the department doesn't have the budget for. You can make it impossible for this man to hide in plain sight." This was the validation Ronald needed. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't a grieving father lost in denial. His plan was sound. He began to channel his methodical energy, the same energy he used to manage the maintenance of an entire school district, into this new, singular mission. He started a spreadsheet, meticulously logging every piece of information he had. He began to sketch out a budget, calculating the cost of printing flyers, of taking out newspaper ads, of what he was beginning to see as the ultimate tool in his arsenal. While the official investigation had stalled, mired in the frustrating reality of a suspect who had vanished across state lines, a new investigation was quietly beginning. It wasn't an investigation of forensics and police work, but one of public awareness and relentless, unyielding pressure. Ronald Kemp had accepted the hard truth that the system might fail his daughter. He had also made the solemn vow that he would not. The long, frustrating months of waiting were over. It was time to build something. Ronald Kemp's plan, born from the quiet desperation of his workshop, was audacious in its simplicity. Earl Danner had become a ghost because he had fled the small, contained world of Jackson County. To find him, Ronald had to expand the search, to turn the entire region into a place where Danner's face was recognizable. He would take the standard wanted poster and amplify it 1,000 times over. He was going to put his daughter's attacker on billboards. The first step was raising the money. A single billboard on a major highway could cost thousands of dollars a month, a sum far beyond the means of a school maintenance supervisor and a teacher. Ronald, a man who had never asked for help in his life, knew he could not do this alone. With Janice's blessing and Frank Garrison's guidance, he began to reach out to the community. He started at his own church, standing before the congregation one Sunday morning, his voice steady, his message clear and direct. He wasn't asking for pity. He was asking for partnership. "The man who harmed my daughter is still out there," he said, his gaze sweeping over the familiar faces of his friends and neighbors. "The police are doing what they can, but he is no longer their top priority. We cannot let him disappear. We cannot let what he did be forgotten. I want to make his face as familiar as the governor's. I need your help to do that." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The grief the community felt was transformed into action. Donations poured in, from the small folded bills pressed into his hand by elderly church members to larger checks from local business owners. The first fundraiser, a simple fish fry in the church parking lot, raised over $10,000. The community had closed ranks around one of their own, their collective sorrow channeled into a shared mission. With the funding secured, Ronald began the logistical work, applying the same meticulous planning he would to a major school renovation. Guided by Frank, he focused on the key arteries of transient travel, the interstate highways and major state routes that crisscrossed Mississippi and the neighboring states of Alabama, Louisiana, and Tennessee. He spent hours on the phone with outdoor advertising companies, negotiating rates, studying traffic flow maps, and choosing the most strategic locations. He designed the billboard himself. It was stark, simple, and powerful. It featured the clearest image they had of Earl Danner, a grainy but identifiable shot from a previous arrest photo. Next to it, in large, bold letters, were the words, "Wanted for an attack in Jackson County." Below that was a new, dedicated tip line number that Frank had helped him set up, a number that would be monitored 24/7 by a team of volunteers, mostly retired law enforcement officers Frank had recruited. The billboard did not mention Ali by name, a deliberate choice made on Frank's advice to keep the message focused and legally sound. But for everyone in Jackson County, her presence was felt in every inch of that sign. The first billboard went up 3 months after Ali's death, on a stretch of I-59 heading north towards Tennessee. Ronald drove out to see it himself. Standing on the shoulder of the highway, with cars and trucks roaring past, he looked up at the massive image of the man who had destroyed his life. Seeing the face there, 10 feet tall, exposed to the world, was a small, cold victory. It was a tangible result, a physical manifestation of his promise. He had taken his grief and hung it in the sky for everyone to see. Over the next few months, 4 more billboards followed, placed at strategic choke points on highways leading in and out of the region. The Justice for Ali campaign, as it became known, started to gain media attention. Local news stations ran stories about the grieving father who had taken matters into his own hands. The story was a powerful one, a narrative of civic action in the face of bureaucratic failure. The tip line began to ring. Most of the calls were well-intentioned but fruitless sightings of men who vaguely resembled Danner, theories from amateur sleuths. Every tip was logged, cross-referenced, and vetted by Frank's team with painstaking diligence. It was a slow, frustrating process of sifting through haystacks for a single, deadly needle. But Ronald was patient. He was a man who understood that complex problems were not solved with a single, brilliant stroke, but with persistent, methodical effort. The billboards were his system, and he had faith in it. He had cast a wide, unblinking net, and now he would wait for the monster to swim into it. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, nearly 8 months after the first billboard had gone up. It came not from Mississippi or Alabama, but from a small city in central Arkansas, over 300 miles away. The woman on the other end of the line was hesitant, her voice a mixture of uncertainty and civic duty. She was a property manager for a large, low-income apartment complex, and she was calling about a man who had worked for her as a handyman for a few weeks the previous fall. His name was Bill, she explained to the retired detective who answered the tip line. "Bill Connor. But that face on your billboard, Lord, I'm telling you, it's him. The eyes are the same. It gave me a chill seeing it. We had to let him go. A couple of tenants complained he made them feel uneasy. He just packed up and left one day. Didn't even pick up his last paycheck. This was different from the hundreds of other tips they had received. It came with a specific name, a location, and a time frame. It had the ring of truth. Frank Garrison felt a jolt of adrenaline, the old, familiar thrill of the hunt. He immediately contacted his old colleagues at the Jackson PD, who in turn liaised with the sheriff's department. The official machine, which had been dormant for so long, roared back to life. Detective Harris ran the alias, Bill Connor, through the system. There were dozens, but one had a recent address history that matched the apartment complex in Arkansas. With that information, he was able to get a warrant to request the employment records from the property management company. The application the woman faxed over was nearly identical in its sloppiness to the one Danner had left at the pool. The key, however, was that this application had been processed by a payroll company, which required a social security number. The number Danner had provided was, of course, fake, but it was a new lead, another thread to pull. More importantly, the Arkansas police were able to visit the apartment complex and, with the property manager's help, identify the specific unit where Bill Connor had been staying temporarily. They secured a warrant and conducted a search. The apartment was empty, but Danner, in his haste to leave, had been careless. He had left behind a half-empty pack of cigarettes on a windowsill. The forensics team from the Arkansas State Police lifted a perfect, clear fingerprint from the cellophane wrapper. The print was rushed to their lab for comparison. The call from the Arkansas Crime Lab to Detective Harris's office in Jackson County came less than 24 hours later. It was a confirmed match. The fingerprints on the cigarette pack were identical to the ones lifted from the crime scene at the pool and from the ghost application Danner had filled out under the name John Smith. They had him. They had irrefutably placed Earl Danner in Arkansas under a new alias, weeks after he had fled Mississippi. The trail, which had been cold for so long, was now blazing hot. Frank Garrison drove to Ronald Kemp's house to deliver the news in person. He found Ronald in his workshop, sanding a piece of wood, his movements as precise and focused as ever. Frank laid out the details of the breakthrough, the call from Arkansas, the alias, the fingerprint match. Ronald stopped his work, setting the piece of wood down gently on his workbench. He listened without a word, his expression unreadable. He showed no signs of elation or triumph. When Frank had finished, Ronald simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement of his head. He looked at the maps spread out on his wall, at the red pins marking the locations of his billboards. One of those pins was just 50 miles from the Arkansas city where Danner had been hiding. "So now they'll find him?" Ronald asked, his voice quiet. "Steady. They'll find him," Frank confirmed. "This is a federal matter now. The U.S. Marshals will take the lead." He crossed state lines, which makes it their jurisdiction. They're the best there is at finding people who don't want to be found. The billboard campaign had worked. It had reached across state lines and plucked a ghost out of the ether, giving him a name and a place. It had forced the system to re-engage, to bring the full weight of federal law enforcement to bear on the man who had shattered their lives. For the first time in 8 agonizing months, justice did not feel like a distant, abstract hope. It felt like an approaching certainty. The U.S. Marshals operate with a quiet, relentless efficiency that is terrifying to those they hunt. They are masters of the patient, unglamorous work of surveillance and intelligence gathering. Once Earl Danner was on their radar, his time as a free man was measured in days. They followed the digital breadcrumbs he had left behind, the fake Social Security number, the payroll records from his brief stint in Arkansas. They discovered he had been paid in cash for odd jobs, and they traced a pattern of him cashing small, personal checks at liquor stores and check-cashing businesses that dotted the I-40 corridor heading west. The trail led them to a dusty, sun-baked corner of West Texas, to a booming construction site on the outskirts of El Paso. They learned that a man matching Danner's description, now going by the name of Rick, had been hired as a general laborer, paid under the table at the end of each week. For 2 weeks, the marshals simply watched. They conducted silent, long-range surveillance from unmarked vehicles, confirming his identity, learning his routine. He lived in a rundown motel, he worked from sunup to sundown, and he drank alone in his room at night. He had become complacent, believing he had once again successfully melted into a new landscape. The call to Ronald Kemp came from a deputy U.S. Marshal, a man with a calm, professional voice that conveyed absolute confidence. He informed Ronald that they had located the suspect and that an arrest was imminent. He explained that they would be taking him into custody at his motel before dawn the next morning. Ronald listened, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. There was a long pause, and then he made a request, his voice low but firm. "I don't want to be at the arrest. I don't need to see that. But when you bring him to the federal courthouse for his first appearance, I want to be there. I need to see it." The marshal understood. He made the necessary arrangements. The takedown happened exactly as planned, in the pre-dawn grayness of the Texas morning. There was no dramatic shootout, no high-speed chase. A team of 6 marshals, moving with the silent, coordinated grace of predators, breached the door of Danner's motel room. He was asleep, and the fight was over before it began. He was pulled from his bed, cuffed, and placed in the back of a government vehicle without a word, his face a mask of dull, groggy disbelief. The ghost had been captured. 2 days later, Earl Danner was transported back to Mississippi to face charges. He was brought to the federal courthouse in Jackson for his initial hearing. As promised, Ronald Kemp was there. He wasn't in the courtroom itself, but in a small, adjacent observation room, standing with Detective Harris and Frank Garrison, watching through a one-way mirror. He saw the door to the corridor open, and 2 large, stern-faced marshals lead a man in an orange jumpsuit into the room. It was him. He looked smaller in person, less menacing than the giant face on the billboard. He was just a man, pale and thin, with dull, empty eyes that refused to meet anyone's gaze. He shuffled past the glass, his head down, his hands cuffed behind his back. Ronald stood perfectly still, his breathing even. He felt no surge of hatred, no rush of vindictive satisfaction. He had expected to feel a storm of emotion, but instead, there was only a profound, hollow stillness. The burning purpose that had driven him for nearly a year had led him to this exact moment, to this sterile, silent room. He watched as the man who had taken everything from him was led away, a powerless cog in the great, grinding machinery of the justice system. Frank placed a hand on his shoulder. "They got him, Ronald. It's over." Ronald didn't respond for a long moment. He just continued to stare at the empty corridor where Danner had been. The system, the one he had lost faith in, had ultimately worked. But it had only worked because he had forced it to. He had taken his grief and used it as fuel, pushing and prodding the machine until it had no choice but to move. He felt no joy, no triumph, only the quiet, somber relief of a promise kept. A chapter had closed. The takedown had been quiet, but for Ronald, it was the loudest sound in the world. The trial of Earl Danner was not a lengthy or dramatic affair. The defense had little to work with in the face of the mountain of evidence the prosecution had assembled. The case was a fortress of forensic proof and eyewitness testimony, each piece locking perfectly into the next. The fingerprints on the application, the DNA from the shed, the surveillance footage of the white pickup truck, the testimony from the woman in Arkansas. It was an unbroken chain of evidence that led directly and irrefutably to the man sitting at the defendant's table. The most powerful moment of the trial, however, came when Ronald Kemp took the stand. Dressed in a simple dark suit, he walked to the witness box with the same deliberate, steady gait he used to walk the halls of the schools he maintained. He spoke in a clear, calm voice, his emotions held in a state of rigid, disciplined containment. He did not look at Danner. He looked at the jury, at the faces of the 12 ordinary citizens who held the fate of his daughter's story in their hands. The prosecutor led him through the events of that terrible evening, his voice gentle, respectful. Ronald recounted the growing worry, the drive to the pool, the discovery of his daughter's car. When he spoke of finding her in the shed, his voice, for the first time, faltered. A single deep crack in his stoic facade. A wave of profound, palpable sorrow washed over the courtroom. He spoke not of violence, but of silence. He described the terrible stillness in the air, the absence of his daughter's life, a loss so total it had seemed to suck all the air from the world. His testimony was not an accusation. It was a testament to the depth of his loss. He was a father describing the worst moment of his life, and his quiet, contained heartbreak was more damning than any shouted accusation could ever be. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict was a formality. Guilty on all counts. As the word guilty was read, a quiet sob broke from Janice in the front row. Ronald reached over and took her hand, his grip firm. He still did not look at the man who had been convicted. Danner was no longer the focus. The focus was the truth. Outside the courthouse, swarmed by a crowd of reporters, Ronald Kemp offered a single, brief statement. He stood before the cameras, his wife at his side, his expression one of somber resolution, not triumph. "My daughter didn't get to finish her life," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. "But today, her story finished with truth. And for that, we are grateful." In the years that followed, the Kemp family dedicated themselves to creating a legacy of purpose from their pain. Ronald, using the same organizational skills and unwavering determination he had applied to the Billboard campaign, established the Alicia Kemp Foundation. Its mission was simple and direct: to promote safety, awareness, and implement better security protocols for young people working in public and semi-public facilities. He developed training programs, lobbied for mandatory background checks for all employees, and successfully campaigned to have security cameras installed at parks and community centers throughout the county. The community pool, which had remained closed for a year, a place too heavy with memory, was eventually renovated and reopened. At the dedication ceremony, the mayor unveiled a new name for the facility, etched on a bronze plaque at the entrance: Ali's Place. It was no longer a site of tragedy, but a symbol of community resilience and a celebration of a life that had been cherished. One late summer evening, years later, Ronald Kemp sat on a bench beside the water at Ali's Place. The sun was setting, casting a calm, golden reflection across the pool's surface. The sounds of children's laughter had faded, replaced by the gentle chirping of crickets. The place was peaceful again. He had not brought his daughter back, but he had honored her. He had taken the darkest moment of his life and used it to build something that protected others, something that would last. He had turned grief into purpose and brought light back to the place where it was lost. For now, he just sat, a father finding a quiet, fragile peace in the long golden rays of the setting Sunday.